5 months after his divorce, Adrian Moretti thought he had everything under control, until he saw his ex, pregnant, and standing with the one man he could never compete with, his rival. What happens when presence replaces power, when truth cuts deeper than betrayal? This story is raw, emotional, and full of twists you won't see coming. I'm Selena. Hit subscribe and let's dive in, because you won't want to miss a single moment of this journey. The hospital hallway smelled like a mixture of disinfectant, antiseptic wipes, and cheap coffee lingering from a vending machine nearby, a combination that pressed against Adrian Moretti's senses with uncomfortable familiarity. He stood near the wall, one hand holding a crumpled safety notice that he didn't intend to read, the other buried deep in his pocket as if it could anchor him in some illusion of control. The fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, casting a sterile glow across the linoleum floor, highlighting the polished shoes of visitors who walked by without noticing him. Every footstep echoed in his ears, each small shuffle and whispered conversation feeling like a personal reminder that he was no longer the center of anyone's world but his own. He had arrived expecting discomfort, perhaps a twinge of resentment or a small, manageable sting of jealousy. What he hadn't expected was the suffocating weight of invisibility that pressed down on him like a heavy coat soaked in winter rain. Adrian's eyes flicked toward the nurse as she approached the small desk, clipboard in hand. She didn't glance at him once, her gaze fixed entirely on Marco Bellini, who stood with a calm certainty that made Adrian's stomach twist. Marco's movements were smooth, deliberate, a man completely at ease with the authority of this moment, the pen sliding across the consent form as if he had signed hundreds like it before. No hesitation, no apology, just the sound of ink meeting paper, a sound that, against the stillness of the hallway, seemed deafening to Adrian. He found himself counting the seconds between the scratch of the pen and the soft exhale Marco allowed himself afterward, each beat hammering a realization he wasn't ready to accept. The world had moved on without him. Adrian's mind raced backward and forward at the same time, tracing every memory of this place, every moment with Elena that had once felt permanent. He remembered her laugh echoing down this very corridor, the soft brushing of her hand against his as they waited for appointments, and now the ghosts of those moments collided with the present in the cold air. The date printed on the file caught his attention. Exactly 5 months after the divorce. 5 months, and in that short span, the position he had occupied in her life, the small corner of her existence that had been his by habit and intimacy, had been filled by someone else's presence. He wasn't replaced through betrayal or anger. He was replaced simply because life moved faster than his hesitation. The quiet, almost ceremonial nature of the exchange made it sting even more. His eyes shifted toward Marco again, searching for some hint of arrogance or carelessness, a crack in the man's facade that Adrian could exploit. But Marco gave nothing. His posture was perfect, the faintest trace of a smirk appearing only in the corner of his mouth, the kind that said, "I know where I belong." Adrian felt a sudden pull in his chest, a combination of envy, disbelief, and the sharp taste of humiliation. It wasn't Marco's fault, and yet the fairness of that realization did nothing to temper the ache. He wanted to step forward, to say something, anything, to remind Elena or Marco, or even himself, that he existed. But his legs refused to obey. He remained frozen near the wall, pretending to read the notice, while his mind screamed in protest. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, every second amplifying Adrian's awareness of absence. No one looked at him. Not the nurse, not the hospital staff, not even the occasional passerby who might have glanced his way. That lack of acknowledgement, of recognition, sank into him deeper than any confrontation ever could. He understood, with a clarity that hurt, that presence mattered more than history, and in that moment, Marco's presence eclipsed everything he had once represented. Adrian's hand twitched, not toward Marco, not toward Elena, but toward the wall behind him, as if bracing himself for impact that was only emotional. He could feel the pulse of his own heartbeat loud in his ears, matching the rhythm of his rising panic. He remembered their last conversation, or what he thought was the last conversation, filled with careful words, polite distancing, an unspoken agreement that distance could protect love. But distance had betrayed him instead, and the truth was now laid bare before his eyes. The casual way Marco had signed the form, the lack of acknowledgement toward Adrian, the gentle ease with which Elena allowed it to happen. It all screamed a single word he couldn't deny: replaced. He felt a surge of jealousy, but it wasn't sharp or explosive. It was quiet, slow, a creeping fog that clouded rational thought and focused every nerve on one thing: the fact that he was no longer necessary in the life that had once revolved around him. A soft cough from behind startled him. A visitor's voice asking for directions passed him by. Adrian realized he hadn't even noticed anyone else in the hallway. His mind had been trapped in the gravity of this moment. He pressed his back closer to the wall, as if blending into it could somehow reclaim some of the lost ground. The pen on the consent form had stopped moving, and yet the weight of what it represented lingered longer than the sound itself. Adrian felt a flicker of anger, not at Marco, not even at Elena, but at himself, for thinking that control, that careful management of emotions, could protect what was never truly his to keep. He glanced at the file again, almost involuntarily, hoping for some mistake in the dates, a misprint that could erase the reality he faced. But the numbers were cold, precise, and unyielding. 5 months, not 4, not 6. 5 months, and he had been quietly erased from her immediate world. Adrian's lips pressed together, a subtle tension forming as he fought against a rising impulse to reach out, to demand explanation, to break the calm that Marco and Elena so carefully maintained. He felt the urge to storm forward, to shout, to reclaim a place that had been given away without challenge. Yet the weight of decorum, of self-restraint, held him rooted, forcing his confrontation inward instead of outward. Then, just as he began to feel the suffocating finality of the moment, Elena spoke, not to him, not in his direction, but casually to Marco, as if Adrian were invisible. Her tone was practical, light, and utterly normal. She asked a question, something about the procedure, and Marco responded with the same calm assurance that had unnerved Adrian since the first second he arrived. That tiny interaction was a dagger disguised as ordinary conversation. Every word, every gesture, every pause confirmed that Adrian was witnessing life continuing without him, a life that he once assumed would always include his presence. The tension in his chest tightened, and for a moment he wondered if it would ever release. The sound of footsteps approaching again startled him. A janitor wheeling a cart laden with sterile supplies. The squeak of wheels against the linoleum mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, creating a background rhythm to the scene he could neither intervene in nor escape from. Adrian's gaze darted between Elena and Marco, taking in the subtle ways they navigated space together, an almost imperceptible tilt of the head, a brief touch of the hand, a shared glance, and each motion reinforced the truth that had sunk in moments ago. He had been replaced, not through deception, not through betrayal, but through the undeniable presence of someone else who occupied what he had once thought was his alone. The minutes stretched on, each second a reminder that his role had shifted from participant to observer. He felt an almost physical pain, a hollowness that filled the spaces inside his chest and stomach. Adrian's eyes fixed on the door to the hospital room, imagining what he might see if he dared to step closer. He could feel the pull of curiosity and fear tugging in opposite directions. Should he move? Should he confront? Or should he remain hidden, a a silent witness to a reality that he could neither change nor control. The tension built, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface, as Adrian remained frozen against the wall, the safety notice trembling slightly in his hand, a fragile shield against a world that had moved forward without him. Elena used to wake before Adrian every morning, the gentle click of the coffee machine signaling the start of a day that had once felt predictable and safe. The aroma of freshly ground beans curling through the apartment had been a comfort, a small ritual that Adrian had grown to rely on without realizing it. He would remain at the dining table, fingers hovering over his phone as he scrolled through messages, emails, and business updates, the soft light of dawn reflecting off the screen and onto his carefully composed face. They rarely spoke in those early hours, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was efficient, a choreography they had perfected over years. Each movement, each glance, was measured, calibrated to avoid conflict and maintain a fragile balance. The clatter of spoons against mugs punctuated the quiet, a rhythm of domestic life that seemed almost sacred in its simplicity. Phone calls were never predictable. They interrupted meals, conversations, and even moments of supposed privacy without warning. Adrian never muted them, never let the vibrations die in silence. He treated each one with disciplined attention, a manifestation of control he believed would guard them both against chaos. Elena, in turn, learned quickly which questions caused tension, which topics ignited sparks that neither wanted to extinguish with words. She stopped asking them, not out of fear, but out of strategy, a deliberate effort to preserve the fragile equilibrium they had created. Their silence became layered, intricate, a language of avoidance and understanding that no outsider could decipher. Adrian often convinced himself that control was synonymous with safety, that if he could manage the details, the emotions would follow suit. Elena, with a quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed, believed clarity built trust. She believed that truth, however uncomfortable, was more protective than control ever could be. There was a pattern to their days, a rhythm that had been etched into the walls of their shared apartment as surely as the sunlight filtered through the curtains. Breakfast, meticulously arranged and consumed in near silence. Short bursts of conversation about errands, work, or obligations, each word carefully weighed, measured, and delivered. Afternoon calls that Adrian answered with a neutral tone, a shield against unexpected scrutiny, and evenings filled with the soft hum of the city outside their windows, the shared quiet becoming both companion and prison. They had become experts at navigating proximity without intimacy, coexisting in the same space while drifting further apart with every measured step. The apartment itself, once warm and vibrant, now echoed with the absence of spontaneous laughter, the lack of physical closeness, the slow erosion of shared energy. Adrian often wondered when the shift had begun, when the delicate balance of their life together had turned into a sterile dance. He recalled mornings when Elena had entered the kitchen with a smile that could fill the room, her presence a quiet reassurance that everything was in its place. But those smiles had become rarer, replaced with efficiency and calm observation, a silent evaluation of whether he was listening, whether he understood, whether he could be trusted with the truth she chose to withhold. Each morning he felt the distance grow, not through confrontation or disagreement, but through the absence of unpredictability, of warmth, of spontaneous connection. It was a slow unraveling, one that neither of them acknowledged, yet both understood. Evenings were worse. Adrian would pour himself a drink, hoping for a moment of reflection, a quiet break in the routine that might allow him to sense the presence of the woman he had once loved. Elena, meanwhile, seemed to move through the apartment with purpose, completing tasks, tidying spaces, her hands busy while her mind remained a fortress he could not penetrate. He remembered the way she would stand by the window, gazing out, as if the city held answers she could not voice aloud. The sight stirred something inside him, a longing for connection that he no longer felt equipped to fulfill. His own reflection in the glass seemed hollow. The man he had been replaced by routine, by responsibility, by habits that no longer served intimacy. There were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when Adrian caught glimpses of the woman he loved before the routine consumed her. A slight hesitation before answering a question, a soft exhale after completing a task, a glance that lingered just a fraction too long. Each time, he felt a flicker of hope that they could reclaim what had been lost, yet each moment was fleeting, dissolving before he could reach for it. Elena noticed it too, and they silently acknowledged the shared tension without ever naming it. It was an unspoken contract: preserve order, avoid confrontation, maintain the facade of normalcy. But every unspoken agreement chipped away at the foundation of trust, leaving a hollow structure that threatened to collapse at the slightest tremor. Adrian's obsession with control extended beyond their interactions. He meticulously organized the apartment, rearranging drawers, checking schedules, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. He believed that by controlling the environment, he could safeguard what remained of their connection. Elena, however, moved like water around him, adjusting, adapting, remaining flexible in a way he could never master. She believed that clarity, honesty, and shared understanding would maintain their bond, but Adrian's rigid structure resisted it. The tension between them became a silent war, fought with gestures, tones, and timing rather than words. Each morning, each call, each quiet breakfast carried the weight of unspoken accusations, carefully veiled regrets, and the creeping realization that efficiency was slowly suffocating emotion. He remembered a particular morning, weeks before the divorce, when a minor disagreement had sparked an unusual confrontation. Elena had asked him a simple question about their upcoming weekend plans, and he had replied with precise instructions rather than answers. Her expression had shifted subtly, slight tightening of her jaw, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes, a pause before she spoke again. He noticed it, and for a fleeting second, the thought of change appeared, the possibility that their rhythm was unsustainable. But Adrian dismissed it, convinced that control, discipline, and careful navigation of each moment could preserve the stability he valued above all else. The morning passed, as did the week, as did the months, each one a repetition of the last, each one reinforcing the distance he was too stubborn to bridge. By the time the sun rose fully over the city, spilling gold across their apartment, Adrian would often find himself staring at Elena from across the table, searching for a sign that she still needed him, that she still trusted him enough to be vulnerable. She would smile politely, nod to his words, and then retreat into her own thoughts, leaving him with the hollow echo of presence that was no longer shared. The quiet agreement they had forged, the one that valued control for safety and clarity for trust, had succeeded only in preserving distance, in creating an environment where neither could reach the other emotionally. The room was full, yet it was empty. The walls held memories, but they also magnified absence. And then there were the calls, the messages, the interruptions that punctuated their carefully constructed routine. Adrian never muted them, believing that by being present in every moment, he could assert a control over unpredictability. Elena learned quickly which inquiries triggered tension, which moments demanded silence, and she adapted without complaint. It was a silent negotiation, one they repeated daily, shaping each interaction into a careful balance between transparency and avoidance. Yet the more they adapted, the more invisible they became to each other, until the apartment itself seemed like a container for two people moving in parallel lines, close in space, but impossible to touch emotionally. Adrian's reflection in the mirror one morning revealed the full impact of their quiet unraveling. His face, once animated with engagement and laughter, now held a rigid calm, an expression honed for control rather than connection. Elena's image, seen in the reflection behind him, was equally composed, but her eyes held a distance he could not bridge. He realized with sudden clarity that they had not fought, not argued, not raised voices to sever the bond between them. They had simply stopped reaching, stopped challenging, stopped risking discomfort for connection. Their love had not ended with fury or betrayal. It had dissolved in routine, in silent agreements, in the deliberate avoidance of anything that might disturb the fragile structure they called domestic life. 3. The envelope arrived on a gray Thursday morning, placed neatly atop Adrian's mahogany desk by his uncle, who had left it without a word and disappeared down the narrow corridor like a shadow retreating from sunlight. Its edges were sharp, its contents heavy before even opening it, a tangible weight of responsibility pressing against Adrian's palms. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the crisp paper under his fingers, as though he could sense the gravity of what lay within before even unfolding the documents. The proposal was structured, meticulous and careful, each clause designed to protect, prevent, and preempt conflict. Adrian could see the reasoning immediately, the logic of surrender disguised as duty, but what he felt was anything but logic. It was hesitation, a simmering knot of unease twisting in his chest like a living thing, tightening with every measured breath. He sat in the high-backed chair, the sunlight slicing across the polished surface of the desk, illuminating the signature lines, the legal jargon, the fine print that demanded careful attention. Adrian read it once, twice, and then again, absorbing the reality that partnering with Marco Bellini was not merely a business decision. It was an acknowledgement of power shifting, of control being ceded in a place he had always believed belonged to him. His fingers hovered over the ink, itching to cross the threshold of agreement, yet resisting with the stubborn pride that had defined him for years. This was a calculated choice, one made in the shadow of inevitability, yet he framed it internally as responsibility, not surrender. There was a thin line between pragmatism and defeat, and Adrian paced it like a tightrope, each step measured, each heartbeat amplified in the quiet room. Elena's presence in the apartment later that evening made the tension almost unbearable. She moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, preparing a light dinner while Adrian struggled with the paper weight in his mind. She noticed the envelope but said nothing, offering only a fleeting glance, a curiosity that Adrian couldn't fully read. She asked once, her voice calm, almost neutral, about the nature of the meeting he had attended, the proposal he had received. He gave her timelines instead of truth, dates and hours as though precision could substitute for honesty, as though chronology could mask the undercurrents of choice and power swirling beneath the surface. Elena's eyes lingered on him longer than necessary, searching, probing, and when Adrian met her gaze, he saw the flicker of suspicion he could not fully soothe. The contract sat on the counter, a silent sentinel of decisions already made, and Adrian had spent the day rehearsing explanations, preparing arguments, imagining confrontations that never came. By dinner, the weight of it pressed on him like a stone in his chest. He arrived home late, documents tucked under his arm, excuses carefully formulated to mask any sign of hesitation or doubt. He navigated the apartment quietly, stepping around furniture with practiced ease, avoiding the soft questions that hovered unspoken in Elena's eyes. He could feel her awareness, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the faint rise and fall of her chest as she anticipated his words. Yet he offered none. The silence became a weapon, sharpened by restraint, by the conscious withholding of truth. Elena, as always, responded with subtlety rather than confrontation. She unfolded one page of the contract and laid it flat on the counter with precision, a simple gesture heavy with unspoken meaning. Adrian's gaze followed the movement, noting the exact placement of the paper, the slight crease at the corner from her careful fingers. He stepped around it without comment, a small act of avoidance that was at once conscious and instinctive. The apartment felt smaller in that moment, the air thick with tension, the ordinary sounds of dishes clinking and utensils scraping against plates amplified into signals of unspoken conflict. Adrian felt the tug of obligation, the need to explain, to justify, to assert that his choices were measured and intentional, but he resisted. The restraint was exhausting, a tight coil of control that threatened to snap with the slightest provocation. He lingered near the counter, pretending to inspect the documents casually while his mind raced. Each clause in the proposal seemed to mock him, a reminder that Marco Bellini's entry into their lives was now sanctioned, legitimized, unavoidable. Adrian imagined the conversations Marco would have, the authority he would wield, the presence he would assert in ways that Adrian once assumed were exclusively his. Every imagined interaction was a dagger of anticipation, a test of Adrian's composure and patience. He could feel a flush of envy rise and fall in rhythm with his pulse, an unwanted companion that tightened his chest and sharpened his thoughts. Each shadow in the apartment seemed to whisper possibilities, each creak of the floorboards a question he could not answer. Adrian recalled his uncle's words, subtle yet potent, a cautionary murmur delivered over coffee and cigars weeks before. Sometimes control is an illusion, Adrian. Sometimes the best move is to let power exist beside you rather than fight to keep it for yourself. At the time, Adrian had dismissed it, bristled at the idea that yielding could be a form of strength. But now, with Elena standing across from him, her eyes steady and unassuming, the truth of that statement pressed down on him like weight in his chest. He felt the collision of pride and pragmatism, a subtle storm building, threatening to break through the carefully maintained calm. Every step towards signing the contract earlier that day had felt like walking across a minefield. Each clause, each term, each paragraph demanded careful consideration, strategic analysis, and emotional suppression. And yet, as he watched Elena move around the kitchen, he realized the true danger was not legal. It was personal. Marco Bellini's presence, formalized by signature and legal obligation, was a permanent reminder that the life he had known with Elena could no longer exist on the terms he defined. He felt a tug in his gut, the creeping certainty that this was not just a business decision, it was the first move in a subtle realignment of emotional territory. By the time dinner was finished, the apartment had quieted. Elena had not pressed, had not demanded explanation. She had folded the document, placed it carefully on the counter, and moved on to her own tasks, a quiet assertion of patience and observation. Adrian lingered in the shadows, his hand brushing against the edge of the counter, mind replaying every interaction, every detail, every hesitation that had led to this moment. The contract was more than paper. It was a line drawn, a choice declared, a future shaped without him fully understanding the consequences. The night air pressed against the windows, cold and indifferent, a reminder that life did not wait for hesitation or regret. Adrian's thoughts circled back to Elena again, and for the first time in months, he wondered if she had sensed the depth of his internal struggle. Did she see his envy, his discomfort, his reluctant acknowledgement that some part of her life would always exist beyond his reach? Or did she, with her quiet intelligence, simply let him wrestle with it in solitude, allowing the weight of choice and consequence to settle entirely on his shoulders? He imagined asking, demanding, revealing, but the words lodged in his throat. The power of restraint, the power of presence, was now a language he could not decode, and Adrian realized that every step he took to maintain control might have been a step away from understanding. The day of the divorce arrived with a quiet inevitability, as if the universe itself had decided that drama and confrontation were unnecessary embellishments to a conclusion already written. The apartment, once a sanctuary of carefully curated routines and silent negotiations, now felt like a gallery of memories that refused to speak aloud. Adrian noticed the faint scent of lavender from a candle Elena had once loved, its presence lingering stubbornly on the kitchen counter, a reminder of mornings that had once started with laughter and coffee. He walked through the rooms slowly, his eyes lingering on the furniture she had left behind, the chairs she had chosen, the small table by the window that now felt like a monument to absence. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if the act of walking could somehow anchor him to a past that had already slipped away. The process was methodical, almost clinical, devoid of the theatrics he had secretly anticipated. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown like daggers across the room. Instead, there were papers, pens, and the sterile formality of legal procedure, each item a quiet instrument of separation. Keys were placed on the polished counter without ceremony, a gesture so simple it felt almost cruel in its finality. Adrian's hand hovered over them for a moment, a brief pause where he imagined picking them up and keeping them, ignoring the boundaries that had been drawn. But he didn't. He let them lie there, a symbol of closure he wasn't ready to verbalize. Elena's eyes met his for a fleeting second, calm and measured, acknowledging the end without the need for words. She had left behind furniture that carried her mark, sofas arranged with deliberate symmetry, a bookshelf organized by her preference, a lamp that cast the warmest light in the living room corner. Adrian kept everything exactly as it had been, convinced that familiarity could soften the sting of change, that seeing the physical remnants of their shared life would act as a buffer against the raw reality of absence. Elena, however, believed differently. She had packed what she needed, taken what mattered, and left behind what symbolized the life she no longer intended to inhabit. Her belief in distance as a clarifying force was a quiet challenge to Adrian's need for control, a reminder that the world could move forward without his consent. The apartment was silent in a way that felt unnatural, each room echoing with the ghosts of conversations never had. Adrian could almost hear the echoes of their morning routines, the soft clink of coffee mugs, the shuffle of feet on the hardwood floor, the muted tones of exchanged words that had once carried meaning. He walked past the bedroom, noting the neatly made bed, the absence of personal items he had once assumed would always be there. The closet, half empty, stood like a testament to transition, a space once full of intimacy now stripped to necessity. He felt a pang, sharp and precise, a reminder that endings are often quieter and more devastating than any shouted argument could ever be. There was no final conversation, no dramatic farewell that might have allowed for catharsis or understanding. The absence of words became the defining feature of the ending. Adrian had imagined a confrontation where truth would spill out, where anger or sorrow would have a shape he could grasp, but none came. Instead, there was a vacuum, a stillness that pressed against his chest and reminded him that endings do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply exist, leaving only the weight of what is past. He touched the edge of the dining table, the smooth surface cold under his fingers, and realized that every familiar texture, every known angle of light, was now a silent observer to the dissolution of what had been. The legal formalities were brief. Signatures were exchanged on documents that seemed to formalize what had already been decided in their hearts. Adrian's hand trembled slightly as he held the pen, aware of the permanence of ink on paper, the irrevocable nature of every curve and line. Elena's movements were calm, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if she were teaching him that endings required discipline, not theatrics. She slid the documents across the counter without a word, and Adrian caught the faintest smile, one that carried neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet acknowledgement of necessity. That small smile unsettled him more than any argument could have. It was a quiet assertion of agency, a reminder that she had chosen clarity and distance over confrontation and lingering doubt. He remembered the mornings they had shared, the careful choreography of their days, and felt a hollow ache as he walked past the spaces she had once inhabited fully. The living room sofa still bore the indentation of her favorite spot. The kitchen countertop still smelled faintly of her perfume, and the bookshelf displayed the remnants of novels they had once discussed with ease. Each familiar sight was a blade hidden in plain view, a quiet reminder of what had been sacrificed in the pursuit of efficiency, control, and muted understanding. Adrian realized, painfully, that the apartment was both preserved and abandoned, a paradox that mirrored his own heart. There were subtle micro-moments that carried enormous weight. The faint click of the apartment door behind her as she left, the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor, the lingering sense of presence in rooms suddenly devoid of it. Adrian lingered in the doorway, eyes fixed on the direction she had gone, listening for a sound that might never come. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, unaware of the personal gravity he was confronting. Each breath felt louder than usual, each heartbeat a reminder of the intimate life that had been quietly erased. As he finally moved through the apartment alone, Adrian noticed details that had previously seemed insignificant. The alignment of books on the shelf, the faint discoloration where sunlight had kissed the hardwood floor, the marks on the wall where pictures once hung. Each detail became a symbol, a reminder of how deeply intertwined their lives had been, and how quickly familiarity could become estrangement. The absence of her voice, her presence, her laughter. These were not moments of drama, but the quiet, relentless erosion of shared life. He realized that the real ending had not been the signing of papers or the physical act of leaving. It had been the slow accumulation of small absences, the quiet agreements, the moments of controlled silence that had prepared them both for this day without ever needing to speak of it. Adrian considered calling her, perhaps to reclaim some sense of closure, some articulation of the unspoken, but the phone felt alien in his hand. Words, he realized, could not capture the magnitude of what had already shifted. He let it sit, unused, a tool rendered ineffective by the subtle and irreversible mechanics of distance and time. Every room in the apartment seemed to watch him, mirrors reflecting his stillness, chairs holding the echoes of shared energy, countertops holding traces of meals they had consumed together without conversation. The physical environment, meticulously preserved, was now a landscape of absence, a territory marked not by conflict, but by deliberate, silent separation. Evening fell with a muted glow, sunlight fading into the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the apartment like reminders of what had been lost. Adrian moved slowly through each room, touching surfaces lightly, feeling the hollowness in spaces that had once been vibrant. There was no anger, no confrontation, no dramatic farewell, only the weight of awareness, the quiet acknowledgement that presence and attention mattered more than the intentions or routines that had defined their coexistence. He understood in that moment that familiarity could soften change for him, but it could not replace what had already been seeded. 5 months had passed since the divorce, yet the apartment remained an echo of what it had once been. Adrian moved through it with mechanical precision, each step measured, each gesture deliberate, as if the routines themselves could fill the void left by Elena's absence. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in corners that sunlight touched at precise angles, a stubborn reminder of a life that had shifted quietly around him. He touched surfaces lightly, not out of habit, but as if by acknowledging them he could preserve fragments of memory before they dissolved completely. The apartment was a museum of his own making, frozen in time, yet suffocating in its stillness. Business continued, stable and predictable, a rhythm that offered him temporary refuge from the storm inside. His partnership with Marco Bellini, formalized by contract and necessity, functioned better than he expected. Meetings were efficient, interactions professional, and Marco's presence never overstepped the boundaries Adrian had silently imposed. Yet every handshake, every brief conversation reminded him that power, structure, and efficiency could not replicate what had been lost. In boardrooms and offices, he controlled spreadsheets, projections, and timelines, but he could not manage absence, longing, or the quiet ache of a life partially claimed by someone else. Adrian avoided places he imagined Elena might visit, cafes she favored, parks she enjoyed, bookstores where she spent afternoons reading. Each location was a minefield of memory, a potential confrontation with the life she had rebuilt without him. He convinced himself that avoidance was discipline, a strategic retreat designed to protect fragile composure. Yet each step into silence was also a step into isolation, a recognition that control could not guard against the heart's unrest. The city moved around him, indifferent, bustling, oblivious, and he interpreted its constant motion as peace, not realizing that the real peace was unreachable in the shadow of his own longing. He deleted her number from his phone, a ritual of severance that felt necessary yet hollow. Adrian memorized it anyway, reciting it in his mind during long nights when the apartment was still and the quiet pressed against his chest. The act of remembering became a small rebellion, a way to assert ownership over fragments of connection that had been physically removed. His mind cycled through imagined conversations, things left unsaid, responses he would never have the courage to voice. Each recollection was sharp, precise, almost surgical, yet it carried an emotional weight that no discipline, no schedule could neutralize. Nights were consumed with reorganizing drawers, recalculating schedules, and meticulously cataloging business priorities. Every adjustment, every shift of paper or pen offered a temporary illusion of control. Adrian told himself that discipline was healing, that order could counterbalance loss. But in the silence between movements, he felt the emptiness grow, a quiet pressure against his chest that no amount of organization could dissipate. The efficiency of his routines contrasted starkly with the incompleteness of his emotions, a duality that left him restless in the early hours when the city beyond the windows hummed with life he no longer fully participated in. Time and distance became both shield and prison. Adrian convinced himself that by measuring each moment, by planning each interaction and avoiding emotional triggers, he could mitigate pain. He walked past familiar streets with a practiced casualness, avoiding eye contact with strangers, scanning cafes and parks for signs of Elena, yet never lingering long enough to confirm her absence. Every step was calculated, a dance between vigilance and denial, each one reinforcing the boundary he placed between himself and the remnants of their shared life. Yet every day ended the same. In solitude, surrounded by familiar objects, grappling with thoughts he could neither quiet nor resolve. The city outside continued unimpeded, its flow of lights, traffic, and chatter moving past his apartment windows as if time itself had no interest in human suffering. Adrian mistook this continuity for stability, believing that the lack of disruption in the external world mirrored his own progress. But beneath the surface, a subtle tension thrummed in his chest, a reminder that outward calm does not equate to inner peace. He felt it when passing familiar buildings, when noticing a cafe table set for two, when hearing laughter that reminded him of dinners and conversations now irretrievably gone. The illusion of control began to fracture, revealing the quiet vulnerability he had long denied. There were moments when he would catch himself imagining Elena in vivid detail. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the curve of her smile when she felt satisfaction, the subtle inflection in her voice that signaled amusement. Adrian knew these were dangerous thoughts, yet he could not suppress them. Each mental image reinforced the truth he could no longer avoid. Distance and routine had not erased presence. They had only disguised longing. He would retreat into business meetings, spreadsheets, and contracts, to stave off the awareness, but the recollections returned like tides, insistent and unrelenting, pulling him toward a realization he was not ready to face. Late nights became a labyrinth of reflection. Adrian would sit at the dining table, staring at neatly aligned papers and the faint imprint of her touch on objects she had once moved, tracing invisible patterns of memory across surfaces now devoid of warmth. Silence was efficient but incomplete, a paradox that gnawed at him with subtle ferocity. Every breath, every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of the city reminded him of what he had lost and what he could not reclaim. The hours stretched interminably, each one a quiet test of endurance, a measure of how long a man could exist in a space defined by absence and memory. The partnership with Marco, although functioning professionally, became a mirror of the void Adrian felt personally. Marco's presence was precise, disciplined, and unthreatening in business, yet in its very predictability, it accentuated the absence of unpredictability and intimacy he had once shared with Elena. Each interaction with Marco was a reminder that presence, not power, defines relevance. Adrian could manage accounts, negotiate contracts, and maintain efficiency, but he could not negotiate for the emotional attention that had quietly slipped away, leaving a gap no professional achievement could fill. Adrian noticed subtle shifts in himself that were almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable upon reflection. The way he avoided certain streets, the careful avoidance of names, the meticulous reorganization of even trivial details, all were attempts to impose order on chaos he could not control. He believed discipline was healing, yet each completed task, each organized drawer, each memorized schedule only heightened the awareness of what discipline could not touch, the deep, relentless pull of memory, of longing, of a presence that had been replaced yet never forgotten. 6. Adrian's morning had begun like any other, with meticulous planning and disciplined schedules that left little room for distraction. Yet the zoning hearing downtown drew him into the city with a gravity he couldn't fully explain. He had intended to observe the meeting from a distance, convinced that professional obligations provided cover, that the mundane bureaucracy of municipal decisions would shield him from personal entanglement. But as he approached the building, the familiar blend of glass and steel, the indifferent hum of traffic, he felt an unfamiliar tension coil tightly in his chest. His pulse quickened, awareness sharpening in a way that no business concern ever had. He found a seat at the back of the hearing room, deliberately distant, a spectator cloaked in neutrality. The room smelled of varnish, paper, and the faint undertone of disinfectant, a sensory reminder of sterile formality. Adrian's eyes scanned the crowd, noting officials in their suits, residents with their clipboards, and the faint anxiety that permeated even the most composed faces. And then he saw her, Elena. She was not alone, nor was she unaccompanied by attention. She stood slowly when her name was called, the motion deliberate, careful, yet imbued with an almost imperceptible vulnerability. The coat she wore didn't close properly, revealing the outline of the sweater beneath, a subtle human imperfection Adrian noted with almost obsessive precision. Marco Bellini's presence was immediate, yet understated. His hand rested against her back, a quiet gesture, practiced and controlled. He never looked in Adrian's direction. His attention was singularly focused on her, precise in its absence of distraction. That restraint, this deliberate control, struck Adrian harder than any confrontation could have. There was no chaos, no shouting, no dramatic assertion of power, yet the perfection of the moment, the careful choreography of gestures, drew a tight line through Adrian's chest. He felt jealousy, not the explosive kind he had imagined, but a slow-burning awareness that attention alone could redefine influence, reshape presence, and claim relevance without words. Adrian's gaze darted between them repeatedly, noting every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture. Marco's hand remained lightly pressed against Elena's back, the tips of his fingers adjusting as if to communicate reassurance without intrusion. Elena's shoulders remained steady, yet her posture suggested both comfort and restraint, an unspoken negotiation between reliance and autonomy. Adrian's stomach tightened as he recognized the silent language at play. Every micro-movement, every gesture, carried meaning he was not permitted to fully interpret. The encounter was both ordinary and devastating, banal and intensely significant all at once. He realized, suddenly, that he had been expecting chaos. He had anticipated confrontation, arguments, even an eruption of unresolved tension. Instead, he found control and composure so perfect, so intentional, that it unsettled him more than any outburst ever could. The lack of chaos, the absence of overt drama, made the encounter almost unbearable. It was the quiet certainty of Marco's presence, the subtle attention he gave Elena, that drove home a truth Adrian had been avoiding for months. Being replaced was not about betrayal. It was about the deliberate and consistent exercise of presence and care. Adrian noticed details that others would have dismissed. The way Marco's fingers adjusted their contact as Elena shifted slightly, the small tilt of her head as she acknowledged a comment from an official, the faint crease in her brow as she absorbed the proceedings. All of it became a tableau of silent intimacy and composure that pierced Adrian more deeply than any shouted argument. His mind raced with memories of mornings shared, routines established, gestures repeated, and yet none of those past interactions could compete with the deliberate precision of the present. Marco did not need to assert dominance or speak loudly. His presence, calibrated and controlled, was enough. The zoning hearing itself faded into background noise as Adrian's attention narrowed to them. The murmur of officials, the shuffling of papers, the occasional cough, all seemed muffled, replaced by the intensity of observation. Every minor inflection in Marco's tone, every measured glance, every adjustment of posture became a vector for Adrian's internal turmoil. He noticed how Elena's hands rested lightly on the podium, how her fingers flexed unconsciously as she waited, how her breathing had a rhythm that suggested calm while her eyes flickered with awareness of Marco's subtle guidance. Adrian found himself memorizing it all, cataloging it in mental lists, as if by capturing these details he could reclaim some sense of understanding or control. The room seemed to stretch and contract with each heartbeat. Adrian's pulse thudded in his ears, louder than the soft murmur of conversation, louder than the scratch of pens against paper. He felt a sudden sharp twist of inadequacy, a recognition that no effort of will, no exercise of discipline could restore the relevance he had lost. Marco's restraint, so deliberate and precise, magnified his absence rather than concealing it. Adrian's chest felt tight, a slow pressure that built with every step they moved, every glance exchanged, every micro-interaction he was forced to observe from afar. Then, in a brief shift of motion, Marco stepped slightly forward, repositioning himself beside Elena to guide her toward a seat. The gesture was almost imperceptible, yet Adrian saw it in detail. The slight bend of Marco's knee, the careful placement of his hand to avoid overstepping, the subtle glance toward her to ensure she felt steady. The precision of it drew a mix of admiration, envy, and silent despair in Adrian. He realized that he had not lost through betrayal, loud confrontation, or dramatic error. He had been quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably replaced by a presence that required no words, no chaos, no justification. Adrian's mind raced, and with it a series of what-ifs he could not contain. What if he had been more attentive, more present, more deliberate in his gestures? What if he had noticed the subtle cues of her needs before Marco had arrived in her orbit? Each thought was a tiny dagger, slicing through pride and resolve alike. He recognized, painfully, that reflection could not reclaim moments lost. Observation alone would not restore what presence had quietly claimed. The tension was relentless, the pressure of helplessness mounting as the hearing continued, each procedural announcement fading into the background while the collision of past, present, and unalterable reality occupied his entire awareness. Elena spoke briefly to the official, her voice calm, collected, controlled. Marco's hand remained steady against her back, guiding without interfering, asserting presence without domination. Adrian noted the subtle alignment of their movements, the choreography perfected through repetition, the quiet dialogue of glances and gestures. The scene was mundane to everyone else in the room, but to Adrian it was a crucible, a live demonstration of how presence could surpass history, how attention could eclipse past connection, how restraint could wield influence more powerfully than confrontation ever could. Every instinct in Adrian screamed for intervention, for acknowledgement, for a challenge, yet he remained rooted, both physically and emotionally, frozen by the recognition that any disruption would only underscore his irrelevance. The humiliation was quiet but absolute, embedded in observation, in knowledge of absence, in the impossibility of reclaiming a place he had once assumed to hold. Each micro-interaction, the tilt of a head, the faint shift of a hand, the alignment of footsteps, etched itself into memory with surgical precision, a catalog of replacement and quiet mastery that he could neither deny nor escape. Adrian sat alone in the apartment later that evening, the documents from the hearing still spread across the table before him, their edges sharp and unforgiving. His mind circled back to what he had observed: Elena's calm composure, Marco's deliberate presence, the quiet gestures that had marked a life already moving beyond his grasp. He had assumed, perhaps instinctively, that the news of her pregnancy would be a provocation, a deliberate strike aimed at his pride, his control, his lingering sense of relevance. That assumption had made the sharp edges of reality easier to bear. If it were betrayal, it was at least tangible, a target he could confront or rail against. But the evidence, painstakingly gathered, left no room for argument. Adrian reviewed dates and timelines, the small details of her life intersecting with his own, calculating, measuring, verifying. Each number, each alignment confirmed the truth he had feared, yet never fully acknowledged. The child was not his. It could never have been. Marco had crossed no lines, no boundaries, no limits of fidelity or discretion. That clarity struck harder than suspicion ever could. Suspicion allows for anger, for confrontation, for a defense. Clarity leaves nothing to act upon, no target for frustration, no tangible villain to oppose. Adrian felt hollowed out, as if the careful architecture of his control and discipline had been dismantled while he watched, powerless to intervene. The realization settled gradually, like sediment in water. Adrian wasn't replaced by deception or betrayal. He wasn't ousted through lies or hidden intentions. The replacement was simpler, more devastating in its subtlety. He had been replaced by presence. Marco's consistent attention, his visible care and measured support had claimed the space Adrian had assumed belonged exclusively to him. Elena hadn't needed to fabricate drama or manipulate circumstance. She had only allowed herself to receive the attention that Adrian, absorbed in control, had failed to provide. The truth was clinical, objective, and impossibly painful. Adrian's mind traced back over months, recalling the ways he had exercised discipline and control, the routines he had enforced, the meticulous ordering of drawers, schedules, and habits. He realized with a cold precision that every act of organization, every carefully measured gesture, had served to distance him emotionally, even as it preserved the illusion of stability. Meanwhile, Marco's subtle attentiveness had filled the gaps Adrian had overlooked, building a presence so quiet, so continuous that it became unavoidable. The thought of it twisted in Adrian's chest, a mix of admiration, envy, and reluctant respect, layered over a persistent ache of loss. He reflected on Elena's choices, her quiet decisiveness, the way she had allowed herself to exist fully in moments Adrian had taken for granted. She had not sought to undermine him, to assert dominance, or to reclaim what had been lost through dramatic confrontation. She had sought attention, consistent and visible, and in doing so had secured relevance, intimacy, and care in ways Adrian had long believed he controlled. The clarity of her strategy struck him with an almost physical force. It was not betrayal that had cost him, it was absence, a void he had unintentionally created through his own obsession with order and self-discipline. Adrian recalled the mornings before the divorce, the routines they had maintained, the efficient yet incomplete conversations. He realized now that what he had thought of as calm, as predictability, had been experienced by Elena as absence. He had controlled details, managed schedules, and enforced discipline, believing he was protecting them both. But the cost had been profound. He had failed to be present in ways that mattered, in moments that were small but cumulative, moments that Marco had later claimed simply by showing up, noticing, and attending with precision. The truth stung sharply. Power without presence is meaningless. Memories surfaced unbidden. Elena folding her arms over a cup of coffee, her brow furrowed slightly in thought, while he navigated calls or emails, her small sighs during evenings spent together in silence, the way she adapted without complaint to his routines. He realized these were not acts of weakness or acceptance. They were subtle negotiations, demonstrations of patience, endurance, and unspoken understanding. Meanwhile, Marco's interventions, though few and deliberate, carried the weight of attention Adrian had never provided. Each recollection added another layer of recognition. Absence had been replaced, presence had been claimed. The apartment felt heavier now, suffused with the knowledge that proximity had been lost not to deception, but to a quiet, inevitable realignment of priorities. Adrian's hand hovered over the table, fingers brushing the polished wood, as he considered what presence truly meant. It was not about arguments, confrontations, or asserting superiority. It was about noticing, acting, sustaining. Marco had done this instinctively, consistently, invisibly, and Adrian had only realized its absence when confronted with the visible consequences. The weight of that truth was almost unbearable. Adrian's gaze drifted to the window, to the city beyond, indifferent, moving forward without regard for personal turmoil. He imagined Elena navigating the streets, enveloped in attention, guided by subtle yet meaningful gestures, shielded by the calm presence he had once assumed he would always provide. He realized that jealousy was misplaced, not toward betrayal, not toward lies, but toward the quiet, persistent power of attention, of human connection, of consistent presence. That realization both enraged and humbled him in equal measure. Every routine Adrian had maintained in the past 5 months, every drawer he had organized, every schedule he had recalculated, now seemed hollow. They had been exercises in efficiency, yet they had not addressed the true deficit, the absence of meaningful, attentive engagement. He understood with painful clarity that discipline without connection could not fill the void left by deliberate care. Presence, not precision, had proven decisive. Marco had never needed to fight or assert dominance overtly. He had only needed to exist where Adrian had failed to truly be. Adrian revisited timelines and dates repeatedly, a silent attempt to find any indication of error or deception, but the numbers aligned perfectly. There was no betrayal to uncover. He realized in the stark stillness of the apartment that the loss was complete, yet quiet. It was not loud, not confrontational, not messy. It was subtle, layered, a slow erosion of relevance, a quiet replacement by a presence that mattered. The child, the attention, the care. It was all tangible, visible, undeniable. And it had been claimed in a way Adrian could neither disrupt nor reclaim. Adrian arrived at the hospital later that week with the careful precision of a man who had spent months controlling everything else in his life, but had learned too late that some things cannot be managed. The air inside was crisp, antiseptic, tinged with the faint undertone of stale coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing quietly overhead. He lingered near the exit, leaning against a cold metal railing, hands folded loosely in front of him. Every detail of the space seemed amplified. The sterile smell of the hallways, the muted murmur of visitors, the shuffle of shoes across tile. He had chosen this vantage point deliberately, a liminal space between what had been and what could never be, a place where observation could replace action without risking confrontation. When Elena appeared, she moved with her usual calm precision, the small but unmistakable grace that had always unsettled him. There was no hesitation in her steps, no glance back, no need for dramatic gestures to communicate what had already been decided in her mind. She approached deliberately, eyes steady, posture composed, and for a brief moment Adrian felt the old, familiar tug of recognition. The woman he had loved, the routines they had shared, the presence he had once assumed he could rely upon. But that recognition was fleeting, replaced almost immediately by the weight of reality. She had moved forward deliberately and decisively, and he was here only as witness. She spoke first, as if anticipating his questions, his protests, his unspoken desires for clarification. Her voice was measured, practical, yet carried the quiet authority of someone who had long since reconciled her own priorities. "The child is Marco's," she said without hesitation, without inflection, without apology. The words landed with precise clarity, each syllable deliberate, stripping away any lingering illusions Adrian might have harbored about possibility or chance. There was no need for drama. The truth itself was sharp enough, cutting cleanly through layers of anticipation, doubt, and personal pride. Adrian listened, absorbing every word with a careful detachment that was half discipline, half self-preservation. He did not interrupt, did not argue, did not ask for clarification. He had long since recognized that questions would serve no purpose here. The facts were immutable. Each word from Elena etched itself into his awareness, a quiet record of what had changed and what could never be reclaimed. She did not seek to wound, and he did not need protection. The exchange was clinical, yet charged with emotional resonance, a collision of honesty and inevitability that left no room for retreat. Elena continued, explaining her intentions with the same clarity that had always defined her approach to life. "I want a life without hidden conversations," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. There was no accusation in her voice, no lingering resentment, only the precise articulation of personal boundaries. Adrian felt a sudden, sharp awareness of how much control he had once believed he held, how fragile the illusion of power had always been. Her words were not meant to hurt, they were a declaration, a carefully measured boundary drawn in the clean lines of truth and practicality. And in that declaration, Adrian recognized the finality he had been avoiding. He considered responding, considered explaining, defending, or apologizing, yet found himself incapable. Words would have been inadequate. Any attempt at justification would have felt hollow in the face of her calm authority. The discipline he had cultivated over months, the routines he had maintained, the careful organization of his environment, all of it seemed meaningless now, irrelevant in the presence of unflinching honesty. He understood fully that truth, in its own quiet way, can be more devastating than deception, for it leaves nothing to misinterpret, no ambiguity to exploit, no room for imagination to soften its edges. Adrian's mind traced back over the past months, the controlled silences, the reorganized drawers, the memorized numbers, the avoidance of places Elena might visit, the careful observance of her routines from a distance. Each act of discipline, he realized, had been both a shield and a trap. He had convinced himself that structure could heal absence, that order could counteract loss, but now he recognized the insufficiency of these measures. Truth, when finally revealed, rendered all strategies moot. Presence, clarity, and timing mattered far more than control or organization, and in these terms, Adrian had failed. He noticed subtle micro-reactions in Elena, almost imperceptible yet impossibly telling. A slight shift of her shoulders, the faint rise of her eyebrow, the measured pace of her breathing, all indicated that her calm was deliberate, practiced, and unshakable. There was no invitation for conflict, no expectation of remorse, no lingering need for validation. Every gesture reinforced the reality he could neither deny nor influence. Her life had moved forward, and in her clarity she had accounted for all eventualities, except perhaps the unspoken weight Adrian carried, the quiet grief of being replaced without betrayal, merely by the presence and consistency of another. The corridor outside the hospital window reflected light in sharp, sterile angles, creating long shadows across the floor that mirrored the shadows now stretching across Adrian's own thoughts. He realized, painfully, that truth does not repair. It does not soften wounds, mend broken connections, or restore what has been lost. Truth only illuminates, explains, and sets boundaries. In this illumination, Adrian understood that his absence, his meticulous focus on order and control, had allowed a gap to form, one that Marco had filled effortlessly, without malice or pretense. The recognition was both humbling and devastating, a mirror reflecting inadequacies he could no longer conceal. Even as he stood there, silent, absorbing the implications of her words, he felt the subtle tension of unfinished business, of emotions unarticulated yet undeniable. The conversation was brief, precise, and final in its practical content, yet it rippled with significance in ways that neither spoke aloud nor could be measured. Adrian felt the quiet ache of missed opportunity, the slow, persistent realization that presence had outweighed planning, attention had outweighed control, and consistency had outweighed discipline. Every carefully rehearsed habit of the past months now seemed insufficient, inadequate armor against the simple power of honesty revealed at the right moment. 9. Adrian walked out of the hospital that day with a sense of quiet finality that weighed heavily on his shoulders. The streets of the city felt different, sharper, as if their usual rhythm had shifted to accommodate the gravity in his chest. He had spent months organizing, controlling, and structuring his life in the aftermath of the divorce, convinced that discipline and distance could create stability where absence had left hollowness. But now, in the stillness after Elena's unflinching honesty, Adrian realized that control without purpose was a hollow exercise. The routines he had built, the avoidance he had maintained, the meticulous observation of her life from afar, they had all been meaningless against the force of presence, the power of consistency, and the inevitability of change. For the first time in months, Adrian felt the weight of choice. Not the strategic choice of contracts or schedules, but the moral and emotional choice that carried irreversible consequences. He could have interfered with Marco, disrupted their partnership, inserted himself forcefully into the life Elena had chosen. He imagined the chaos it could have unleashed: arguments, accusations, legal maneuvers, public spectacle. But he did not. Every instinct that once demanded dominance and control had been tempered by understanding. What use was influence without clarity? What victory existed if it required undermining what had rightfully become someone else's presence? Adrian understood with painful acuity that some battles are not meant to be fought, and some territories once lost cannot be reclaimed. The decision crystallized quietly. He mailed Elena the spare key he had kept all these months, the physical symbol of access and possession he had once clung to as a measure of control. There was no note, no message, no attempt at explanation, just the bare gesture of closure, an acknowledgement that the past belonged to her now entirely. As he dropped the envelope into the mailbox, he felt a fleeting sting of regret, but it was tempered by the recognition that sentimentality, too, could become a trap. The key was not a plea, it was a release. The act itself was profoundly unceremonious, yet in its simplicity lay an emotional weight that no note, no apology could have captured. Weeks later, Adrian passed the same building, the familiar facade unchanged, its glass panels reflecting the bustling city around him. The doorman recognized him immediately, offering the same polite nod he had given countless tenants over the years. That recognition, once a source of quiet reassurance, now felt empty. The familiarity that had once anchored him no longer provided comfort. The spaces he had navigated with precision now reflected absence rather than presence, echoing with the memory of choices made and opportunities lost. Adrian realized that he had spent years protecting a life defined by control, only to discover that the very preservation of order had cost him what truly mattered. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, observing the world with a new clarity. People moved with purpose, unaware of the personal upheavals taking place around them. He noticed small interactions, friends laughing together, lovers holding hands, parents guiding children through crowded streets, and each sight struck him with a quiet intensity. Presence mattered more than planning, attention more than discipline, connection more than control. These truths, so simple yet so profoundly difficult to embody, had revealed themselves through loss, through absence, and through the relentless clarity of what could no longer be reclaimed. Adrian reflected on the partnership with Marco, the life Elena had chosen, and the distance he had maintained from both. He understood now that power without relevance is an illusion, that stability without meaning is fragile, and that influence without presence is impotent. For years he had sought to protect, to control, to order the chaos around him, believing that security and certainty would shield him from pain. But the protection had come at a cost far greater than he had anticipated, the cost of emotional absence, of missed opportunities, of allowing presence to slip quietly into someone else's hands. In the quiet of the late afternoon, Adrian paused near the entrance of the building. His gaze lingered on the polished marble steps, the clean glass doors, and the subtle movement of people entering and leaving. He imagined Elena moving through these same spaces with Marco, her life now filled with attention, consistency, and the kind of presence he had once believed he could maintain. A pang of jealousy arose, not sharp or explosive, but precise, like a cold edge cutting through measured reflection. Yet alongside that sting was understanding. She had chosen visibility over absence, connection over control, life over the hollow routines he had clung to for so long. Adrian's own reflection in the glass caught him momentarily. He looked into his eyes, searching for remnants of the man who had once believed he could control everything, who had structured life meticulously to protect what he thought he valued most. There was still that man there, disciplined, precise, and calculating, but now tempered with a hard-earned awareness of limitation. He understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that protection alone does not ensure fulfillment, that careful planning cannot replace attention, and that control is meaningless when the human heart moves independently of schedules and contracts. He walked away from the building with deliberate slowness, absorbing the weight of all he had learned, all he had lost, and all he could not reclaim. The city carried on, indifferent yet alive, its rhythm unbroken by personal grief. Adrian realized that life, like the city, moves forward with quiet insistence, that loss is both personal and universal, and that every choice leaves an imprint, whether visible or unseen. In the silent understanding of these truths, he felt the finality of the chapter closing, not with drama, not with confrontation, but with the deep, immutable weight of awareness. The spare key he had mailed remained unclaimed in his mind, as well as in the mailbox, a symbol of access relinquished, of boundaries respected, of past connection acknowledged, but no longer demanded. Adrian understood that he had protected not just physical assets, contracts, or routines over the years, but also his own perception of control, his careful construction of order in a world that now seemed indifferent to it. And the cost was permanent. Presence had been claimed by another. Attention had been received by another. What remained for Adrian was understanding, acceptance, and the slow, quiet process of moving forward into a life defined by choice rather than control. As dusk settled over the city, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps and traffic lights, Adrian continued his walk alone. Each step was measured, deliberate, yet unburdened by the illusion of reclaiming what had been lost. He carried with him the weight of experience, the clarity of truth, and the knowledge that control is only meaningful when paired with purpose, and presence is the currency of human connection. The ending was not loud, not dramatic, but it was complete. The life he had protected, the rules he had enforced, the routines he had maintained, all had taught him their lessons. And he walked forward, heavier yet wiser, carrying the permanent cost of absence and the irreversible gift of understanding. If Adrian's story taught us anything, it's that presence matters more than power, and truth, even when painful, always finds a way to the surface. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real, emotional stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. I'm Selena. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.